Maya Colton was a successful tech entrepreneur, a woman who had built her empire from the ground up. A few years ago, she had made a strategic investment in an airline, Airbright Airlines, which had become one of the biggest names in the industry. Although Maya wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations of the airline, she held a significant stake in the company. This made her a quiet yet powerful figure in the corporate world. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a shareholder, someone whose opinions mattered behind closed doors. On this particular day, Maya had just wrapped up a major keynote speech at the Silicon Valley Tech Summit. The crowd had been engaged, and the investors had been pleased. It had been a good day, a productive day. Maya was ready to head home, back to her family and her quiet life. After several days of hectic meetings and networking, she longed for nothing more than a calm evening with her husband and children. Her flight back to Charlotte was booked, and she had paid for a VIP seat, a little luxury that would offer her some peace on the way back. She had purchased the VIP ticket just like everyone else, but to her it was worth it. It wasn't about bragging rights or showing off. It was simply a small reward after a long week. A window seat, some extra legroom, early boarding, the kind of comfort that could make a big difference after a draining conference. Maya walked through the terminal, her roller bag clicking against the polished floor of MSP Airport. She was exhausted, but content. This flight would give her the chance to relax before returning to the chaos of daily life. But as she made her way to her seat on the plane, something unexpected happened. As she was getting settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached her with a polite but firm smile. "Excuse me, Ms. Colton," the attendant said, her voice low. "One of our premium passengers is seated in the back, and we were hoping you would be willing to switch seats with him." Maya looked up, slightly confused. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's a request from one of our frequent flyers who's part of our loyalty program. He was expecting an upgrade, and there seems to have been a mix-up. We were hoping you could move to a different seat." Maya frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. She had paid for the seat she was in. It was hers, and it wasn't as if the flight was full. There were plenty of empty seats. Still, she didn't want to cause any problems, so she responded calmly. "I'm sorry, but I paid for this seat," Maya said, offering a polite but firm smile. "I'd prefer to stay here." The flight attendant's smile tightened a little, but she nodded. "Of course. I'll let the crew know," she said before walking away. Maya settled back in her seat, confident that the matter was over, but she was wrong. A few minutes later, another flight attendant approached her, this time a senior member of the crew. She was wearing a more formal uniform and had a clipboard in hand. "Ms. Colton," the flight attendant said, her tone a little more insistent, "we understand that you declined to switch seats, but unfortunately, we need you to move. It's company policy when there's a seating conflict with high-level loyalty passengers." Maya blinked. "High-level loyalty?" she asked, a note of confusion in her voice. "I paid for this seat. I don't understand why I need to move." The senior flight attendant paused, clearly trying to remain professional. "He's part of our premium loyalty tier, and we need to accommodate him. We're asking for your cooperation in this matter." Maya felt her patience starting to thin. She had booked this seat days ago and had received no notice of any issue until now. Still, she remained calm and said, "I paid for this seat, and there was no mention of any conflict. I'd prefer to stay where I am." The flight attendant didn't argue. She simply nodded and walked away. Maya thought that was the end of it. But 5 minutes later, the situation escalated again. 5 minutes after the senior flight attendant walked away, Maya began to relax again. She was trying to dismiss the situation as just a minor inconvenience, but that calm would soon be shattered. Another flight crew member approached her, and this time the tension was palpable. She was holding a clipboard, and there was no trace of a smile on her face. "Ms. Colton," the flight attendant said, her voice carrying a subtle but firm tone, "I'm afraid we must insist. You've been reassigned to another seat." Maya looked up at her, disbelief creeping into her chest. "I beg your pardon?" she replied, her voice steady but sharp. "This is Seat 24B, the attendant continued, gesturing toward the middle of the cabin. "And we need you to gather your belongings and move immediately. It's part of our company policy to prioritize certain customers based on their loyalty status. Your seat is needed for a high-tier passenger." Maya's eyes narrowed. She was starting to feel more than just irritated. She was beginning to feel humiliated. This wasn't how she imagined her flight home would go. She had earned this seat, paid for it like everyone else, and now she was being told she had to give it up because someone else was more important. "Wait," Maya said, standing up slowly. "Are you telling me that the person in 24B is more important than me?" Her voice was calm, but the words carried a weight she couldn't suppress. The flight attendant paused, almost as if considering her response. "It's not that simple, ma'am," she said, maintaining her professionalism. "But this is standard procedure when there's a seating conflict. The system prioritizes loyalty members, and it's important that we follow that policy." Maya let out a small sigh and stood up from her seat. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving," she said, her voice still calm, but filled with an underlying frustration. The flight attendant didn't argue further. She just gave a tight-lipped smile and nodded, as though she was used to dealing with this kind of resistance. But the moment Maya stood up and started walking down the aisle to seat 24B, she felt every eye on her. She could sense the stares of the passengers around her, some pretending not to look, others openly watching the scene unfold. The walk down the aisle felt like an eternity, and every step seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Some passengers whispered to each other, some tried to avoid eye contact, but one younger woman in 12C couldn't contain herself. "That's not right," she whispered to her neighbor, her voice tinged with disbelief. Maya could barely hear her, but she caught the words. They stung, but they also made her feel less alone in her frustration. She was angry, but she also felt the weight of the situation settle deeper within her. As Maya took her seat in 24B, the discomfort was immediate. The space was tight, wedged between a young man in basketball shorts who was listening to music on his headphones and an elderly woman who kept asking if this was the flight to St. Louis. Maya didn't answer her. She simply stared straight ahead, her fingers tightly gripping the armrests, trying to control the rising frustration in her chest. As the plane taxied down the runway, Maya could feel the sting of being moved from a seat she had paid for no reason other than a person with more loyalty points needed it. The whole situation felt wrong. It wasn't just the inconvenience or the lack of respect, it was the casual nature of it all. The smooth, rehearsed way the flight attendants had handled it, the lack of acknowledgement that Maya was a paying customer, had only made the humiliation feel sharper. From behind, Maya could hear the murmur of passengers. "I think they moved that guy," one said. "Yeah, I saw that. So messed up," another replied. A few people around her were whispering, some in shock, others in support. But Maya remained silent. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't looking for applause. She just wanted to be left alone. But the whispers didn't stop. The noise around her had shifted from casual chatter to something more intense. Maya wasn't the only one who had noticed the unfairness of the situation. She pulled out her phone, but not to post on social media or make a complaint. She wasn't ready to turn this into a public spectacle. Instead, she scrolled through her emails trying to distract herself. But even as she did, the discomfort lingered, and the noise from the rows behind her seemed to amplify. And all the while, a young teenager a few rows ahead of her, Janie Ruiz, had quietly been filming the entire interaction. She hadn't meant to go viral when she started recording. It was just a moment she felt compelled to capture. But as she saw the flight attendant's request for Maya to move, something about it felt wrong. Janie knew she had to hit record. This wasn't just another minor incident. This was something worth sharing. Maya didn't notice her filming. She didn't notice the camera or the steady rise of the internet's wrath. She was simply trying to hold her composure. She was trying to keep the heat from rising to her face, but it was difficult. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't a personal issue. This wasn't about her pride. This was about a system that was inherently unfair. As the plane ascended into the sky, Maya tried to shake off the embarrassment that was creeping into her chest. She wasn't angry in the traditional sense, not in the way someone might get angry over a small inconvenience. No, this felt different. It felt like a quiet humiliation, one that was more insidious because it was so calmly handled. The flight attendants had followed the procedure, smiled and spoken with a professionalism that made the whole thing feel more rehearsed than real. Maya stared out the window, trying to focus on the clouds below. She needed to calm down. But as much as she tried to focus on the scenery, her mind kept returning to the same thought. How could they do this? How could they so casually take her seat without even a word of apology? Was it because she wasn't a frequent flyer in the company's loyalty program? Was she being dismissed so easily just because she wasn't considered important enough to deserve the seat she had paid for? Across the aisle, a few rows behind her, a teenager named Janie Ruiz sat with her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She had been recording the entire interaction on impulse. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, maybe a quick clip for her social media stories. But as the incident unfolded, Janie realized this wasn't just an everyday interaction. This was something people needed to see. She hadn't expected the video to blow up, but the moment she posted it, something sparked. Without any hashtags, without any dramatic background music, she uploaded the footage with a simple caption: "He paid for it." The message was clear, unembellished, and powerful. Maya's calm response and the polite insistence of the flight attendants contrasted so sharply that the rawness of the video hit hard. The video spread quickly, first among her friends, then among their friends. Within hours, it was everywhere. Maya didn't know any of this. She had turned her phone to airplane mode, trying to shut out the noise and distractions. As the flight leveled out, she closed her eyes, thinking about the small things waiting for her back home: her kids, her husband, and the quiet comfort of being in her own space. But despite her best efforts, the unease was still there. The tension from the flight, the sense of being completely dismissed, wasn't so easy to shake off. By the time she opened her eyes, the plane was cruising smoothly, and Maya had nearly forgotten about the chaos behind her. But then her phone buzzed. She glanced down at it, half expecting a message from her husband, something about dinner or the kids. Instead, it was a string of notifications from her colleagues and friends. 3 missed calls, 2 text messages, a notification from LinkedIn. Her heart skipped as she saw the link a friend had sent her. "Maya, you're trending." Confused, she clicked the link. The video of her calmly being asked to move seats was playing, along with a few snippets of her response. "I paid for this seat." The video was everywhere. The comments beneath were flooding in by the second. "I would have lost it way earlier than this," one commenter wrote. "Her calmness is incredible, but this is ridiculous," said another. "Airbright Airlines seriously needs to apologize," a third person added. Maya stared at her phone, the weight of the situation starting to sink in. She had been the center of a minor inconvenience just hours ago, and now her name was plastered all over the internet. The video was spreading like wildfire. People were talking about it in ways that Maya hadn't anticipated. What had started as a quiet moment of personal discomfort had now exploded into a public spectacle. Maya wasn't angry. She wasn't even upset in the way one might expect. She was surprised, stunned even, that something as personal as this had taken on such a public life. She had simply wanted to fly home quietly. Now she was part of a much larger conversation. And it wasn't just about her anymore. The comments continued to pour in, and Maya realized that the story was growing beyond her. People were identifying with her experience, feeling the unfairness of it all. As the plane began its flight toward its destination, the murmurs around her were no longer about the flight itself, but about what had just happened to her. In the seat next to her, the young man in basketball shorts leaned over, looking at her phone, still processing the situation. "Hey, people got your back," he said, nudging her gently. "I saw the video. That's messed up." Maya nodded but didn't respond. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't looking for a hero's welcome. But something had shifted in her, and she knew she couldn't simply sit back and let this go. By the time the plane touched down at Midway International Airport, Maya was already a household name. The smooth landing that should have marked the end of an uneventful flight felt like an afterthought. The moment the seatbelt sign pinged off, Maya sensed the eyes on her. Those quiet glances from other passengers, the subtle but unmistakable whispers that followed her as she made her way down the aisle. Her phone buzzed again, more persistent this time. It slid off her lap as she fumbled to catch it, and as she turned it over, the sheer volume of messages took her by surprise. There were texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, and calls. She hadn't expected anything like this. What had started as a small inconvenience had now turned into a media firestorm. One particular email caught her eye, and it was from someone at the Chicago Tribune. "We'd love to speak with you about your experience." There were other emails too. The New York Times, CBS News, and even a few local reporters wanted to hear from her. She didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to make of it all. As she walked through the terminal, Maya could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her. A middle-aged woman with a beige tote bag turned to glance at her. Then another woman did the same. Just ahead of her, a man in a Hawaiian shirt raised his phone and started recording. Maya knew this was no longer a private matter. It had gone public, and now she was no longer just a passenger. She was a symbol. When she reached the front of the plane, where passengers usually exit first, the flight attendants were waiting for her. There were 3 of them standing quietly by the galley. None of them looked her in the eye. She paused for a moment, not to start an argument, but to give them a chance to say something, anything. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. The attendants avoided her gaze completely, offering nothing in terms of an apology or even acknowledgement of what had happened. As Maya stepped off the plane, her phone buzzed in her hand again. There were new texts, new notifications. Her inbox was flooded. But this time it wasn't just from reporters. A Facebook notification popped up, followed by Twitter, and then a slew of messages from old colleagues and acquaintances. This wasn't just about the incident anymore. People were now talking about the airline's practices. The video had spread too far, and the story had become a conversation about power dynamics, customer loyalty, and unfair treatment. Maya made her way to baggage claim, but her thoughts were miles away. The quiet trip home, the simple goal of reuniting with her family, now seemed like a distant memory. As she stood waiting for her luggage, a young man in a red hoodie approached her. He was around 20, maybe younger, his hands shaking slightly as he nervously spoke. "Ms. Colton?" he asked, his voice tentative. "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. I think what happened wasn't right. Thank you for handling it the way you did. Honestly, I don't think I could have done it without losing it." Maya gave him a small nod, a simple acknowledgement. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. The young man hesitated, almost as if he wanted to say more, but instead just stepped back into the crowd. He wasn't the only one. People were beginning to notice her, beginning to understand the injustice that had occurred. But Maya still didn't know how to feel about the attention. Outside, she called for a rideshare, the buzzing in her hand constant. As she sat on the bench waiting for the car, Maya looked at her phone again. There was a message from Airbright Airlines corporate office. A generic, apologetic response stating that the company was aware of her experience and would be reaching out. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maya didn't bother replying. She knew that the apology would be hollow, an attempt to smooth things over. She had been a passenger in their system, paying for the service, and yet she had been treated as secondary to someone with higher loyalty status. It wasn't just a personal grievance anymore. It had become an issue that resonated with a larger audience. People were angry, and they weren't going to let it slide. By the time she got into the car and headed home, Maya was already starting to realize that this wasn't just going to go away. The incident had sparked a broader conversation, one that was bigger than her. Airbright Airlines would be under pressure to explain themselves, to change something, and Maya wasn't sure what role she would play in that change, but she couldn't sit idly by anymore. As her car pulled onto the highway, she thought about how fast everything had escalated. She didn't ask for this. She didn't seek out attention. But now that the conversation was out there, she knew she had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to the people who had rallied behind her. Maya wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a symbol, and in the coming days, the world would be watching to see what happened next. The next few days passed in a blur for Maya. The media attention was relentless, her inbox filled with messages from reporters, influencers, and even some well-known public figures who wanted to share their thoughts on the incident. Maya had become the face of something bigger, a movement about fairness, corporate accountability, and customer rights. The viral video of her calmly standing her ground had turned into a symbol for those who felt overlooked and mistreated by big companies. Though Maya didn't want to be part of a spectacle, she couldn't ignore the growing demand for change. She was contacted by several media outlets, including CNN and NPR, for interviews. Her first instinct was to shy away, to keep her life private. But as she read through the messages from people sharing their own experiences, from parents who had been humiliated by similar situations to workers in other industries who felt undervalued, she realized her voice mattered. The platform she had now wasn't about her. It was about giving others the courage to speak out. The morning after the video went viral, Airbright Airlines issued a statement. The apology was, predictably, vague. They expressed regret over the situation, but stopped short of admitting fault. They promised an internal review and a deeper look into their policies regarding seating assignments and customer treatment. It wasn't a good apology, but it was a start. Maya didn't respond to their statement immediately. She was still processing everything: the public outcry, the support from strangers, and the realization that her one moment of discomfort had led to an overwhelming wave of change. The backlash against Airbright was growing, with people demanding accountability, not just from the airline, but from the industry as a whole. As the days passed, the pressure mounted on Airbright. Customers shared their own stories of mistreatment, and the media began digging into the airline's past policies. It wasn't just Maya's incident that was troubling. It turned out that others had experienced similar issues. A story from 2019 resurfaced about a woman who was reassigned from her seat to accommodate a loyalty program member. The similarities in language and procedure were striking, and it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. The real turning point came when Maya received a phone call from a senior director at Horizon Mobility Group, the parent company of Airbright Airlines. The director, Colton, wanted to speak to her off the record. Maya wasn't sure at first, unsure if this was another PR stunt, but she agreed to take the call. Colton was upfront with her. "We've seen the video, and we've heard the outrage. Some of us in the company are listening. We'd like to invite you to consult with our leadership board on customer equity and internal accountability. Paid, of course. No strings attached, just perspective from someone who clearly understands fairness." Maya paused, considering the offer. It wasn't a path she had planned to take. She wasn't interested in being part of some polished campaign or using the incident to further her own career. But something about Colton's honesty made her reconsider. This could be her chance to make a lasting change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been subjected to similar treatment. After thinking it over for a couple of days, Maya agreed. She told Colton that she would only accept the offer if every meeting began with a recorded anonymous testimony from real passengers and crew members. The idea was simple. People's real stories had to be heard. No branding, no editing, just the truth. 2 weeks later, Maya found herself sitting in a boardroom in Dallas with 12 executives from various airlines. The room was full of charts, data, and corporate speak, but Maya's eyes were focused on the people around the table. She knew they could change the system, but only if they were willing to listen to the real stories. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't talk about policies or numbers. She simply asked, "How many of you have ever been treated unfairly? How many of you have sat in a seat and been told you don't belong there? If we don't address these issues, they will keep happening. Next time, it might not be caught on camera." The room was silent. Over the next few months, Maya worked closely with the airline executives to draft what would become known as the Seat Fairness Framework, a set of guidelines designed to prevent the arbitrary removal of paying passengers, regardless of their loyalty status. It was an effort to standardize how seat assignments and customer complaints were handled. This framework was eventually adopted by Airbright Airlines and 2 other major carriers, becoming a key talking point in an FAA policy review. Maya didn't get rich from this. She didn't want the fame, the interviews, or the recognition. What mattered to her was that the system had changed. When she boarded her next flight, booked in seat 1C, the best seat on the plane, she wasn't asked to move. She had earned her seat, and no one could take that away. As the months went on, Maya returned to her routine. She went back to her business, to her family, to the quiet life she had before all of this started. But every now and then, she would get a letter. A high school teacher in Missouri wrote to her, saying she showed Maya's interview to her students, teaching them about how small actions could mean big things. She told them, "You don't have to shout. Just stay where you are if you've earned that space." Maya kept that letter. It was a reminder of why she had stood her ground. In the end, Maya didn't become a celebrity or start a movement. She didn't go on a nationwide tour or create a new brand. She simply did what was right. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world.